Alright, as you can see, we are beginning part 2 of chapter 14 of the Jarrett book dealing with the 1960s. And let us continue. So we're going to start with number 17. We did the first 16 terms in the first video. And so we're going to jump into the next 20 or so terms, about 25 minutes worth. Number 17, the McCarran-Walter Act. This was passed in 1952. It had kept immigration quotas at 1920 levels. And we talked about in the previous chapter 3 of the immigration laws that are passed in the 1920s, all dealing with setting up a quota system, restricting immigration from certain parts of the world. And of course, the parts of the world that were favored was Western Europe. And we're looking at countries like England and France, for example, being those countries that were to benefit from this. So what we're looking at in 1952, keep in mind we're only 7 years removed from World War II. We are at the beginning of the Cold War. And so it was believed that by maintaining these 1920 levels, where we are favoring Western European nations, nations that of course had helped create the United States of America, that we would be able to keep out troublemakers that may cause a problem for the United States down the road. I mean, we go back to the 1920s, you had Sacco and Vanzetti, for example, who had come from the new immigrants from Eastern or Southern Europe, and they, of course, as we discussed, were tried, convicted, and executed for murder in a botched robbery. And so it was felt that by passing this law right there, we could maintain a certain amount of control over immigration, not allow people in that we didn't want. All right, let's move on to our second one here, number 18, the Immigration Acts of 1865. All right, I'm back. I paused for a second. There was a typo there. I read the Immigration Act of 1865, and it should have been 1965, so I made that correction. So, okay, sorry about that. The Immigration Act of 1965 aimed to be less biased. Each country was given identical quotas for its number of legal immigrants. It also restricted immigration from Latin America for the first time. Now, what we're looking at again, as we've talked about, 1960s, very troubling time. We have the Cold War, we have the space race, the arms race, nuclear proliferation, on and on and on. And as we had seen earlier in the McCarran-Walter Act, we had in 1952 kept levels, immigration levels, at the same where they were in 1920. But as the 1960s unfold, we're having a little bit of a different look at things. For one thing, we tried to be less biased. We tried to give each country additional quotas. So the same number of people from England were allowed in from Italy, and on and on and on. But what we did do for the first time is somewhat interesting for a number of reasons, is that Latin American immigration was restricted for the first time. Prior to this, I mean, Latin American movement from Latin America to America was pretty much unhindered. For decades, Mexicans would cross the border into Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, wherever they may go. And then they went back. They'd come back and forth 2 or 3 times a year, come over, work a little bit, go back home. And now we're starting to really look at the Latin American immigration, Mexican immigration in particular, but Latin American immigration as a whole, in greater depth and detail than ever before. And so it's a shift in our policy. All right. Number 19, Barry Goldwater, Republican presidential candidate in 1964. He, of course, was going against LBJ. He helped revive the conservative ideology of the 1960s. He's often thought of as sort of the grandfather of modern conservatism. He attacked LBJ's Great Society as being socialistic. Now, he lost the election relatively easily by pretty good margin, but what he did was create an environment where we could look at LBJ and the growth of the government and the safety net that LBJ was creating as a part of the Great Society, and we could label it as socialistic, which again, many people to this day still believe that it was, taking money from people in the form of taxation and then giving it to others who have really done nothing to earn it. And so his view of conservatism, smaller government, less taxation, strong military, so forth and so on, paved the way for the conservative movement that we have today. Let's move forward. The women's liberation movement, also known as the feminist movement. You can use either one, women's lib or feminism. Women in the 60s, and this would be in the 1960s, not in their 60s, but in the 1960s, were still largely housewives and mothers. Now, again, there were millions of women who had broken that mold and gone to school, gone to college, become professionals, teachers, lawyers, doctors, some politicians as well, of course. But this movement was aimed at a much larger crowd, larger numbers. The feminist movement attempted to achieve greater economic and social equality for women through education and through jobs. So the myth, as the feminists would call it, is that women were happy being housewives and mothers. They called it a myth. They attempted to dispel that myth, and we'll take a look at a couple women who were a large part of this in the next slide. But the feminist movement attempted to persuade women that being a housewife or a mother, just being a housewife or a mother, no other job outside of the home, was not really as fulfilling a life as they could have, that they could have a career, they could have the home and the family. And they felt that, and again, it's a little difficult for you to see because of the Siri desktop trial, but they believed that women could achieve greater economic and social equality through feminism. All right, let's move on. So we're looking at now, we have a couple of women, as I mentioned in the last page, and then we're going to look at a couple of the women who led this feminist movement, and we'll start with Margaret Mead, who's number 21 on the list, an anthropologist. She saw women's low status in Western society. That would be, of course, the Western democracies, America, England, France, West Germany. She saw this as a creation. Let me go ahead and shrink the size of that green line a little bit. There we go. She saw this as, creation of a male-dominated power structure rather than as a biological necessity. What that means, essentially, is that men did this because it was easier for us. That men created a society where women were second-class citizens, where women stayed at home and took care of the house, had children, took care of the babies, took care of the needs of their men, their husbands, and we men did this because we could do it as part of the power structure that we built for ourselves. It wasn't a biological necessity, but it was something that was done because men did it because we could do it, because we wanted to keep women in their place in a male-dominated, make sure we understand this, a male-dominated power structure. Men dominate the country, and we created a system where women would be a second-class citizen. Why? Because we could, not because it was required. Women, out of biological necessity, biological creation, biological gifts, if you will, women give birth. Men can't. So that's a biological necessity. What they're saying is that everything else men created to make it easier for ourselves. Okay, let's go on to the next one. The sexual revolution. And the feminist movement, which was a term we had on the last page, attacked traditional roles of women in America, particularly those roles of women in America, particularly as being seen as sex objects. That men, because of this male-dominated power structure, we viewed women as sex objects, sexual objects, things to sell cigarettes or beer or whatever the case may be. Okay? That we men did this, and women saw themselves as sexual objects as opposed to being treated as a full human being, that they were just women. Okay, so as a way to overcome this, sex education was taught in schools, birth control pills protected women from pregnancy. So again, the sexual revolution brought about by the feminist movement, they saw women, they attacked the traditional roles of women in America as being essentially sex objects to men, things, not truly people, and that women were not being treated like a full human being because, again, they were female. And so, as part of this sexual revolution, sex education was taught in schools. Birth controls allowed women to not get pregnant, allowed to control their pregnancy more easily. Number 23, Gloria Steinem founded a magazine known as Ms. Magazine, which was devoted to women's concerns and viewpoints. Prior to this point, pretty much all magazines had more or less of a male-dominated theme, even though magazines were often geared toward women. Vogue magazine, which is about women's fashion, or you can go back earlier, it's 4, 5, 6 decades earlier, you had things like McCall's magazine. It was aimed at women, but it was controlled essentially by men. So Ms. Magazine was was a magazine founded by women, run by women, and devoted to women's concerns and women's viewpoints, which all too often are a little bit different than men's. I mean, let's not argue about this. Men and women have different viewpoints on a number of issues, and Ms. Magazine was aimed at women's views as opposed to magazines written and edited by men aimed at women. All right, number 24, Betty Friedan. All right, Betty Friedan wrote the book The Feminine Mystique. The book, which I'm sure you can find, I'm sure it's still in print somewhere. I don't know if we have a copy here in the library, but this book challenged the belief that educated suburban housewives were happy doing nothing more than keeping their homes clean and preparing dinner for their families. Now, this is sort of the traditional American family at the time, or at least the view of it. If you were to look at TV shows of the 1960s, late 1950s, 1960s, you would find a typical family. You have a husband, a wife, and 2 or 3 kids. And the husband would go to work every day, and the woman would stay at home, and she would keep the house clean, and she would volunteer at the local hospital, local library, local school. And when the husband came home, she was usually dressed really nice and had dinner ready or a drink for him as he came in the door. And that was the prototypical family you saw on TV. And there's a number of TV shows, Ozzie and Harriet, for example, in the 50s. And you can go to My Three Sons. The only thing missing from My Three Sons was a wife. That eventually comes later in the show. But there's any number of these shows where Leave It to Beaver. Oh my gosh, Leave It to Beaver. Grew up watching these things where you had the husband and the wife, and again, the husband would go to work, the wife would stay at home, and she would take care of the house and the kids, and the father would come home from work, and the wife would have a martini for him, and he'd walk in the door and give it to her, and she would give the martini to him. And how's your day, husband? How's your day, dear? And then they sit down to dinner, and everybody's dressed all nice and neat and party, and he's still wearing his coat and tie from work, and on and on and on. And so she, Betty Friedan, in her book, The Feminine Mystique, challenged that belief that suburban housewives were happy doing that. Basically nothing more than keeping their family homes clean and preparing dinner for their families. She believed, she being Betty Friedan, believed that women were capable and should compete for jobs with men. Now again, this is a concept today that's not an issue anymore. This has not been an issue for a number of years, partially because of things that were happening that we're looking at now. Were women often treated as, essentially bubble-headed sex objects? We use them to sell beer and cigarettes. Yeah, we still do that today, by the way. If you don't agree with me, go watch TV. Okay, watch any commercial. Watch a beer commercial. They're going to be fat, ugly women on yachts drinking beer. No. Look at some of the TV commercials that you see in the Super Bowl, during the Super Bowl, where women are involved. I mean, these are all gorgeous women. And so, attractive women, attractive men, sell stuff. So, was she correct that women could compete, were capable, and should compete? Was she correct in that? Yes. That's pretty much a staple of today. And so, what Betty Friedan, and the next couple we're going to get to, and we've got another 5 minutes of this when we finish up, do this one. We'll probably cut this one a little bit short. But anyway, what Betty Friedan and all the others we've talked about, all the ones we will talk about, wanted to achieve, they essentially have achieved, to the most part. Okay, let's move forward. The National Organization of Women, also known as NOW, N-O-W, National Organization of Women, became the chief voice for women. Now again, I don't really know if that's true. I don't know if NOW was a chief voice for women. They did get a lot of of attention. They did get a lot of publicity. But whether or not they were the chief voice, I mean, I don't really know about that. I'm stalling here for a moment because I'm having some problem with my drawing board. And I think we are back. There we go. Sorry. I was having some problem with my drawing board, so we're back. The National Organization of Women became the chief voice for women. Again, I'm not sure if that's true. In their minds, yes, and in the minds of the rather left of center media, that's true. But for our purposes, we will allow that to stand as part of this definition. So the National Organization of Women challenged traditional ways men and women viewed each other. Okay, not uncommon. We do this kind of stuff every so often. And wanted to do away with gender-specific terms like policeman, fireman, and they wanted to go with police person, fire person, so forth and so on. And there has been a movement toward that. Some people call it political correctness. Some people call it other things I cannot repeat because there's you're minors. But what we're talking about was the attempt by women in the 1960s, the National Organization of Women, now challenging traditional ways men and women viewed each other. Again, you look at a situation, you have a boss, you have a subservient individual within the company. If someone were to tell you in 1965, well, I just got a new job. Talk to my boss today. Well, what did he say? Never assuming that your boss could be a woman. There was a joke on a TV show, kind of a riddle more than a joke, All in the Family, which we'll talk about and probably look at a little bit of a clip later on. In the 1960s, All in the Family featured the father and the mother, their daughter, and their son-in-law. The lead character, Archie Bunker, was a racist, blah, blah, blah. We're not going to go into all that at this time. Anyway, a next door neighbor moves in, a woman who was maybe not a member of NOW, but at least a feminist, a woman who was closely associated with the beliefs of NOW. And one day she had this joke, this riddle, and she basically said that an ambulance brings in an injured person to the ER. Their doctor walks up and says, "I can't operate on him, he's my son." Who's the doctor? Well, man, it's his father. No, it can't. It's not his father. Well, it's his stepfather. No, it's not stepfather. They go on and on and on. Eventually, the woman who gave the riddle said, "No, it's his mother." And so no one in the show at that time would have thought that the surgeon, the doctor, could be or would be a woman. So that is what they're talking about challenging these traditional ways that we viewed each other. Now, I'm not going to lie to you. This is stupid right here. Okay, some of the things that we have gone to. Now, again, okay, you want to get away from policeman? Okay. But, things like manhole cover, that's kind of dumb. And we're now even attempting to do away with gender-specific pronouns like him and her and those types of things. I think we've taken this a touch far. So, by and large, what they're trying to do here is not a bad thing, but I think in some cases they've gone a little far. We can talk about that later on. Our last one on this page, and the last one we'll do for this video, because we're a little over 20 minutes, Equal Pay Act of 1963. Congress, by the way, Congress should be capitalized, sorry about that. Congress passed this law, or wrote this law, requiring companies to pay women the same wages as men for the same work. Now, again, for us today, not a problem, okay? This is how we see it. Now, of course, in my profession, as a teacher, my profession's pay is based on years of experience. You take a man, you take a woman, they each have, like myself, this is my 32nd year as a teacher. If there's a female teacher on this campus who has 32 years, she's making the exact same pay I am, assuming she has the same education, because I do get a little bit of extra money for my master's. If you had a woman, female teacher, 32 years and a master's, she should be getting the exact same pay that I am. Now, if that woman's coaching, she'll make more than me because she gets a stipend for coaching. If she's doing UIL, she gets a little bit more than I do. But essentially, in my field, in my profession, which is the only job I've ever had as an adult, we get the same wages for the same work. Now, that's not always true. And the idea behind this law was to ensure that people were paid the same regardless of their gender. Now, do you still find some of this bias? Well, yeah. I mean, you hear stories about Congress. There are a number of stories about President Obama, who was paying less money to women in his staff, on his staff, than men. Now, whether this is true or not, I don't know. But I remember the story popped up about a year or so ago. So there's still some of these issues today. In my field, teaching, yeah, same wages, same work. Again, assuming everything is equal, like education, experience, and those things. Now, there's all kinds of number of other ways you look at this. Let's just go with one real quickly. The WNBA, the Women's National Basketball Association, versus the NBA, National Basketball Association. Women playing in the WNBA make far less money than men playing in the NBA. Well, there's a number of reasons for it, and it comes down to really putting people in the seats, in the stadiums. Kobe's no longer the best. Whoever is the best these days, LeBron, whomever, it doesn't really matter, okay? You know, they fill the stadiums with tens of thousands of people. They have multi-billion-dollar contracts for the NBA with ABC, NBC, I mean, all the different networks. The WNBA has a much smaller following and is on far fewer television sets. So for that reason, the men get paid more than the women. Is that right or is that wrong? Well, you got to look at what kind of money is the league generating in that case. Now, again, if we're talking about a math teacher, if we're talking about a CPA, we're talking about a lawyer. You take two lawyers, you got a male and a female. The female lawyer wins far more cases than the man, she should make more. On the other hand, if the man wins far more cases, and let's talk about big cases. Let's just talk about, jaywalking. Let's talk about murder cases. I mean, huge, high-profile cases. If the man wins more of those cases, he should be paid more. If the woman wins more of those, she should be paid more. Okay, kind of going off track here a little bit, so let's finish this up. So we have just finished part 2 of our chapter 14 vocabulary terms.